During the first quarter of 2010, much had happened in the world. Most of it was behind political walls and far from the households of a simple blue-collar worker. None were too worried. Earlier this month, Princess Diana had died during a horrible car crash. The public funeral of the Princess of Wales started at 9:08 a.m. in London when a tenor bell sounded to signal the departure of the cortege from Kensington Palace. The coffin was carried from the palace on a gun carriage along Hyde Park to St. James's Palace, where Diane's body had remained for 5 days. The Union flag on top of the palace was lowered to half-mast. The official ceremony was held at Westminster Abbey in London and finished at the resting place in Althorp. 2,000 people attended the ceremony in Westminster Abbey, while the British television audience peaked at 32.1 million, one of Britain's largest viewing figures ever. Worldwide, 2 billion people observed the events, making it one of the most watched events in history. In Russia, Zhuganov dealt with the breaking up of the independence groups. By doing this, he would secure his own position and weaken the others. This followed his promised path of strengthening his nation through diplomacy and words, rather than brute force. In the UK, the government started to invest more time and money in protected networks. The internet had made its surge during the late 90s and early 2000s. Young generations were as accustomed to it as if it were there all along. Therefore, the sophistication at which some could cope with this required more secured protocols and networks. There was still a red scare amongst the government that might spread its influence online where it could do so uncontrolled. Then more news arrived from Africa. Just over a week since his speech to thousands in Baida, Supreme Court Judge Mustafa Abdul Jalil had been killed by a lone gunman. In the northeastern city, Jalil was supposedly meeting with fellow men of law to discuss his resignation from the powerful position, until he met his assassin face to face a few blocks away. Pulling a pistol out of his coat, the unknown assailant shot Libya's angered judge 3 times in the chest before he flew away on his motorcycle. Even before emergency services could arrive, Jalil was already dead. In Central Europe, things continued the way they always did. France and Germany once again continued to be the school example of obedience, since both of them wiggled their tail to the call of their masters. Both put money in military air support for the Red Army. Of course, there were many French and German citizens who did not agree with the Red Menace, but the total regime they found themselves under dared not question any forms of protests. With the UK standing alone, it would need to become more independent. The increase in factories across the entire country was one thing, but the industry overall would need help from outside for the time being. With Europe crushed under the boot of the communists, David Owen reached out to the Rio Tinto industrial concern that harbored back in the days of the British-Australian Corporation. Gaddafi was losing control over his precious AIR. Polls done publicly saw an increase in different ideologies, partially fueled by the occurrences over the past 3 months. Many could feel that a revolution was imminent. But interestingly enough, multiple parties claimed such a revolution, meaning the forces that would initiate this would be splintered. And things were only getting worse and worse in the following days. Halfway through April, protests broke out all over the nation. Hundreds upon hundreds of protesters were killed in the city of Baida within less than a week. Generals and police chiefs told Gaddafi that the situation could return to normality peacefully and with minimal bloodshed on both sides. However, this was never the case, with soldiers brutally slaughtering protesters throughout Baida and surrounding towns, as well as gassing neighborhoods they deemed full of dissident rebels. The situation had become even more dire, and the National Cabinet was expected to convene and discuss a course of action. Despite the commotion happening in the AIR, some neighboring nations like the West African Union were not too worried that similar sightings might spill over across their border. Rather than focusing on preemptive damage control, they continued on with their original industrial plans. The same could be said for Chad, though its focus on air support could imply to some that the use of drones to spy on civilians as well. The Sudanese Union, with its revolutionary socialists, of course were happy to see the turmoil occurring and some even believed weapons and supplies were provided to several parties at the border with the Islamic Republic. All the while this was happening, Angela Davis continued to resurrect former Las Vegas into a place of prosperity, reaping the benefits for her own. They were still far off from completing the entire step plan, but her will to let go of the former city was well established by now. Then on the 1st of May 2010, disaster struck, and what came to be known as the May Day attack was set in stone. The American People's Commonwealth had been attacked at the heart of its biggest city. Before 9 in the morning, a hijacked aircraft from Chicago collided with Tower 1 of the NEC, bringing with it a terrifying explosion of fire and debris. As New York's waking populace stood with shock and horror at the sight of jumping workers and flames engulfing every floor near the observation deck, it did not take long for a second speeding jet to hit Tower 2. At this point, the world had tuned into breaking news of a terrorist attack on American soil, the first of this scale in history. But then almost an hour later, all those watching must have gasped simultaneously at the most horrific thing to be seen on television. Tower 1 came crumbling down on top of itself, killing 1,000 within and too many below the building, already struggling to escape the flames that had almost trapped them. But from tragedy came bonding, and for the next 40 days the American People's Commonwealth mourned, but also looked at the future, pronouncing that its people's spirits remained undented. Despite the giant tragedy, stability and political power rose as people joined hands together, realizing once more that they were all Americans in the end. But for Chomsky, paranoia had set in. His government was devastated with the attack and even lost some of its belief to protect its people. Therefore, the American Peace Act would promise its citizens to deal with this. But the act itself had multiple functions if one were to read between the lines. Chomsky's governmental hold would increase slightly, as did the premium rise for resource gathering in the region. But the utmost purpose was an increase in decryption capabilities to spy on the people both within and outside of the APC. As this notion was well hidden within the Act's terms, it went over the heads of many. But those who did notice wondered if the attack was orchestrated by its own government to grant more grip and control over its people and bordering nations. On somewhat of a brighter note, in the UK the plans to increase its nation's industry continued, and part of this was to implement better robot technology. Robot tech had come a long way over the past decade, but there was of course always room for improvement, with better results and better efficiency. Then more drastic news arrived from Africa. Where many believed that Gaddafi was backed by all his generals and military staff, it came as somewhat of a surprise to some of the higher-ups in the government that some resigned. In the public unexpected announcement to the Libyan people, several generals from the recently re-established Libyan army announced their immediate resignation and condemnation of Colonel Gaddafi's administration. Among other reasons, the most prominent cause of their shock loss of confidence was the rapidly growing movement for democracy in Libya, with over 1 million protesters now demanding regime change across the country. Until now, the words had only been whispered quietly by members of government and Congress. But if a civil war was to occur, more generals might resign and join a new cause they deemed worth fighting for. Then at the end of the month, people finally got some answers on who was responsible for the May Day attack. A previously unheard of far-right underground group in Illinois and Indiana regions had claimed responsibility for 5/1. The White American Liberation Front proclaimed a new beginning for the Commonwealth. According to their masked leader, May Day's tragedy was just the beginning of a series of attacks against America. They would never stop until socialist rule was over. Intelligence agencies were scrambled to uncover more details about this group, but so far, efforts had proven fruitless. However, it became increasingly clear that they could have direct connections to the Vermont insurgency that ended earlier that year. This suspicion led to Governor Bernie Sanders publicly declaring that he would work with Philadelphia in any way that would result in the destruction of this repulsive organization. It seemed that unrest and turmoil were sprouting its roots in different continents by now. On the surface, things seemed calm, but in a lot of people's hearts and minds, fear was taking hold, which is exactly what the ones who wanted to plunge the world into chaos once more wanted to see.